Smith started his campaign against the use of child labour.
His Crick connection was quite brief.
These followed the seasons and had spread the length and depth of Britain.
He could walk up to 15 miles.
Hey me old bod, how you been? And welcome to A Thing of the Past. Today we're looking at a local reformer whose hardship and sacrifice changed the lives of children for generations to come. As you watch the episode, think about how our experiences make us who we are, and do we have equivalent figures in society today? We hope you enjoy the episode.
For 15 years, his name was daily before the public. When Parliament was in session, he spent the forepart of the day in Paternoster Row and Fleet Street, among the publishers and the pressmen. In the evenings, he was as frequent in the lobby as the Speaker was in the House of Commons. For weary years, he fought a hand-to-hand fight with poverty, hunger, distress and persecution, while being known, respected and on good terms with the highest in the land. These were the words of Edwin Hodder in 1896, speaking about our reformer for today, Mr. George Smith of Coalville. Born in 1831 in Tunstall, Staffordshire, to William Smith and Hannah Hollins, George Smith's life looked as good as decided for him. He was born in the Clay Hills area of Tunstall. Due to the Industrial Revolution, villages were becoming towns and towns were becoming cities. The vast amount of clay seams in Staffordshire meant that it was home to a thriving brickworks and tile industry, which George's dad was employed in. At the age of just 7, George would follow his dad into the brickyards. You're probably aware that in the past, children had to work to support their families, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. The most famous of these, I think, are the chimney sweep children and the children who worked in the mills. What might surprise you is, by the time George was 10 in 1841, 2 Acts of Parliament had been passed to alleviate the distress of the chimney sweep children, and 6 Acts of Parliament had been passed to alleviate the distress of the children working in the mills and the textile factories. One of these in particular, in 1833, meant that children between the ages of 9 and 13 could not work for more than 8 hours a day. They had to have 2 hours education per day, and there was a factory inspector who came round and checked the factories. Although these laws weren't enforced to the full, the government was offering its handout to the children in these industries. However, the children like George, who worked in the brickyards and the tile yards, were forgotten. George Smith himself, at the age of just 9, when he would have weighed about 55 pounds, was required to carry 40 pounds of clay from the pug mill to the moulders, and in a day he could carry about 5 tons of this. On other occasions, he'd be carrying bricks from the moulding room to the kiln, and in a day he could walk up to 15 miles. For a day's work of 13 hours, he would be paid only 6p, which today is the equivalent of about £1.60. George's chances were improved by his family being primitive Methodists. He attended Sunday school, and between the ages of 5 and 7, he attended a dame school. As he worked his way up around the brickyards of Staffordshire, he sent himself to night school with the money that he earned. He also eventually owned his own brickyard in Reepsmoor, 7 miles north of Leek. However, due to the remoteness of the yard, this venture failed. Wherever George went, he would give back to what the Sunday school gave him, and Coalville Primitive Methodist is no exception. George Smith was instrumental in the setting up of the Sunday school here at Coalville Primitive Methodist.
His first wife sadly passed away in 1866, and there is a plaque to her inside the church. In 1859, Smith became the manager of the Whittick Colliery Company brickworks, close to where I'm standing now. There is some uncertainty about whether he discovered the seams of clay and spoke too soon about what he had found. The company does seem to be unscrupulous. He signed a contract thinking that he was becoming the owner, when in actual fact, he only became the manager of the brickworks. However, he was allowed to run the company on his own principles and proved that a brickyard could be more profitable without employing child labour. In 1868, Smith started his campaign against the use of child labour in the brickyards. Through letter writing, publicising, lobbying, and the publishing of his book, A Cry from the Children of the Brickyards of England, he was able to get a bill introduced into the Factories and Workshop Act that meant from 1872, no female under the age of 16 and no boy under the age of 10 would be allowed to work in the brickyards. The impact of the Act meant that over 10,000 children were taken away from its horrors and sent to school. The next injustice that George would target would be the plight of the canal children. The successful passing of the brickworks legislation had led to much animosity in Coalville. His employers gave him an ultimatum: either give up the campaigning or lose his job. He chose the latter option, and in 1873, with a wife, 5 children, and another on the way, he fell into poverty. He sold most of his possessions and rented a damp house in Coalville where the ceilings leaked. However, George would not give up on his principles. Undeterred, Smith's campaign for the canal children continued. In 1875, he published the book Our Canal Population, A Cry from the Boat Children with Remedy. In numerous articles, he described the cramped, dark conditions lived in by the canal children. On one boat, there'd sometimes be a mother and a father and up to 8 children. Smith decided that this needed to change.
As a result of his representations on the subject, the Canal Boats Bill was introduced in 1878 and provided for the education of children on canal boats and regulated the sanitary condition of life on board. Although a step in the right direction, George believed that further improvements could still be made, and he continued to press the issue. In an article published in the Leicester Chronicle in 1884, he described an interaction he had with a child living on the canal at Paddington Basin. I came upon a few days since a poor boat girl of 10 winters belonging to a registered boat, in charge of a big heavy boat horse with a foot that seemed at every step ready to crush the poor child into the mud upon the towing path as they tramped along together. A few questions gently put elicited that she was born in the cabin, or dark floating cage, and that there were living in the cabin at the present time father, mother, and 5 brothers and sisters of various ages, not one of whom could tell a letter except the little girl, and she had only attended a day school 1 week in her life, and during that 1 week she remarked, with pleasure in her face and fire in her eyes, "I learned my ABC." She further stated that she had had 3 more sisters and brothers born in the cabin, one of whom, a big boy, was drowned in the cut some time since, and a sister of 6 years old who died of fever last Whitsuntide in the boat cabin and was carried, when cold, by her mother in her arms through the public streets to her aunt's. Just as she was in the midst of her pitiful tale, her father came storming along the towing path, the sight and sound of whom sent the poor girl into tears. With much persuasion and a little tact, I turned aside the threatened vengeance, and on the poor girl sped, her way at the heels of the horse, shouting with a trembling, screaming voice, "Come up." It was articles like this that meant that later in the year of 1884, another bill was passed strengthening the provisions of the first. The Canal Boat Amendment Act required all canals and boats to be registered and regularly inspected to avoid overcrowding. Once again,
Smith had alleviated some of the hardships of the 100,000 persons living on the canals.
Whilst campaigning for the canal children, Smith had also started to raise awareness of the condition of the gypsy children, which he described in his book Gypsy Life in 1880. The gypsies that Smith was concerned with were those of the lower caste persecuted Indians who had arrived in Scotland around the 1530s. These followed the seasons and had spread the length and depth of Britain. Around Smith's time, there was around 18,000, but he claims that their ranks were swelling due to English vagabonds, people who were on the run from the law, joining that way of life. Their tents would consist of sticks bent over with rags thrown over the top.
Some of the experiences George had among the gypsies were published in the Graphic in 1880. He described the typical scene inside their tents. In the centre of the covering is a large opening, through which the smoke from their fire passes. The bed consists of a layer of straw upon the damp ground, which has to be replaced every 10 to 14 days with new straw, or it will either become rotten or broken to dust. Like the canal children, there could be sometimes 2 adults and 8 children living in a tent. Despite the publication of the conditions and lack of education among the gypsies, a movable dwellings bill embodying his views was proposed in Parliament at least 4 times between 1885 and 1891, but was always defeated. Since his dismissal from Whittick Colliery, Smith had spent 13 years in great poverty whilst campaigning for the canal and gypsy children. He spent any money donated to him on further campaigning and sacrificed a job that today would have earned him more than £70,000 a year. He did this so that he might devote his life entirely to his causes. However, things would start to look up for George financially later in life, resulting in him being able to move to our next location, Crick in Northamptonshire.
Throughout his years of poverty, the only money George had received through public subscription was about £15,000. In 1879, an application was put into the civil list, but this came to no avail. Finally, in 1885, £300 was rewarded from the Royal Bounty Fund, and with it, George purchased this house behind me, and he called it the Cabin. After moving to Crick, George became involved in the local religious community here, and he created a group called the Band of Love, who would meet here at the White Cottage behind me.
At the age of 64, his health began to deteriorate, and after consulting a number of doctors without success, he was finally given a diagnosis of cancer of the liver.
He spent his last few weeks with his friends and family around him, and the band of the Rugby Primitive Methodist Church would come and play songs underneath his bedroom window.
His Crick connection was quite brief.
We then met Jim Goodger from Crick Historical Society, who gave us a great insight into George's final years in the village and the legacy that the Smith family left behind. He then pointed us in the direction of George's grave.
George died on the 21st of June 1895 and is buried here in St Margaret's Churchyard. His grave says that he is 65, but he was actually 64. He chose this spot as just across the road is the old school, and he said he wanted to be close to the children, the people who he had helped all his life. At the actual funeral, children gathered around the grave and threw white flowers onto it until the coffin was completely covered, as they celebrated the life of the children's friend.
Although largely forgotten today, the impact of George Smith's life on our present society cannot be understated. His campaigning relieved pressures and created reform in not only child employment, but living conditions and education. His determination to support those on the fringes of the educated, well-to-do Victorian society that is commonly known today must be admired. With his education, he could have sat back and accepted the well-paid job offered to him and settled for his lot. Instead, he absorbed the principles of his religion and acted upon them. The pressures of modern life seem designed to trap oneself in the so-called rat race, resulting in people replacing principles with practicality. George's defiance meant that reform was initiated and instated, and that the horrors he had experienced as a child himself became a thing of the past.